Tatiana Metanova would be woken up one morning in June by her sister Dosha, who was telling her about her new love, to hear a government announcement, broadcast on the official radio. A communication which announced all citizens of the Soviet Union to join the ranks of the glorious Bolshevik Party to smash the German enemy. The Metanov family received the news that would forever change the lives of each of them. Now, the old stories of the grandparents of Tatiana, Babushka and Dida, about the evacuations and bombings of the wars, would see the realization. Her only brother, Pasha, on the order of his father, immediately began preparations for departure to the camp in Tolmachevo. Everything changed in a few seconds. Deep in thought about the changes that would happen to her simple working life at the Kirov plant, Tatiana was charged with the task of buying the necessary food for her family. Dressed in her sister's red sandals, her only Sunday dress and her long yellow braided hair, Tatiana came out of the two-room apartment where they all lived together. Walking for more than 1.5 kilometers and seeing closed banks, long queues of people and few rations left, she realized that the Metanovs were late discussing. Tired of the futile attempts at shopping, that day took a different turn when Tatiana saw an ice cream shop where she decided to get her favorite creme brulee ice cream. For 5 minutes, the war no longer existed for Tatiana. Exactly, at this moment muttering her favorite song, "One day we will meet in Lvov, my girlfriend and I." Tatiana's blue eyes would see the soldier staring at her, whom she would unknowingly have him the soldier of her heart forever. Boarding both on the same bus, Tatiana and Alexandri would have a seemingly superficial conversation that would pave the way for a great love. Seeing Tatiana's innocence and naivety, Alexander, as a good officer, managed to provide her everything she needed for her family in that dark period of war that was coming. What Tatiana did not know yet was the fact that when they entered the house to take the shopping, she would understand that the words of her sister who was waking her up that morning were dedicated to Alexander. And this would be the beginning of Tatiana's dilemma between right and wrong, where for the sake of her sister and her happiness she chose to remain silent. The next day, which coincided with Tatiana's birthday, a new tradition would begin, where Alexander would wait her every afternoon outside the Kirov factory so that she would not return home alone during that time of war. Days passed, Dosha fell more and more in love with Alexander every day, and so did Tatiana, and the war progressed more and more fiercely. Tatiana stopped conversations, meetings, and secret walks with Alexander so as not to throw her sister's life into the abyss. Everything was getting worse, and so it was with the Metanov family when they found out that Tatiana's brother had gone missing. Abandoning work at the factory, Tatiana set out for an ordeal of suffering looking for her brother, but what she found was an explosion from German planes from which Tatiana's body ended up among the corpses to be later found by Alexander and his battalion in a search routine. A long period of hospitalization and Alexander's loving care would strengthen their love for each other even more. With every step, with every breath, Tatiana found herself lying to her soul. She wished that Alexander would not approach her again. Lie. She wanted Dosha to separate from Alexander. Lie. Alexander hid everything behind a smile. Lie. The war was progressing wildly. This was not a lie. The explosions killed Tatiana's father, the mother was devastated, the food ran out and a deep gap was created between the remaining members of the Metanov family. Alexander had been in the middle of the war for a long time, finding it impossible to bring them some food from his ration. All this time, Tatiana was starving and going crazy for Alexander. Weakened by poverty, her belly managed to fill only in those few rare meetings with Alexander where he managed to return alive once again from the war. The days that passed brought Tatiana the news that her grandparents were dying one by one, and not only them but everyone around her. Alone on the streets of Leningrad at that time, in that harsh winter, the weakened Tatiana had to walk over corpses to try to find any gram of food that she, Dosha and her mother would need to survive. A little later, not even moms, only Doshas. Plunged into despair by the loss of their mother, both lonely sisters Alexander decided to leave Leningrad. The ill Dosha did not think that she would be able to reach her destination alive, and so it happened. Dosha, seriously ill, lost her life, leaving Tatiana alone in that broken world. After months without news, Alexander took a 30-day vacation where he would try to look for Tatiana in the direction he had sent her months before and found her in a small village called Lazarevo, where it seemed like war was not existing in the middle of sunlight where Tatiana was shining. It would be the most beautiful period of their lives, where they lived in love in a small wooden lodge where Alexander worked and Tatiana cooked, and both fell in love more and more every day. On June 23, 1942, Tatiana, dressed in the only Sunday dress, and her handsome soldier Alexander, signed their identity cards to write, "Alexander and Tatiana beloved married." That's how they lived that period. From breakfast to dinner, it was just the two of them, working on their love lodge, cuddling, cooking, playing, talking endlessly and falling in love even more. Days passed and none of them spoke about Alexander's return to the war. They could not talk about the future. They simply existed, those two young lovers in Lazarevo. Both knew very well that they were living the happiest days, times that they would never experience again. Tatiana was dedicated to her without a break, and Alexander wished to have the opportunity to live together with her all of his life. To have the opportunity to inhale her fragrance and hear her melodious voice every day. On the morning that Alexander was going to leave, they could neither be seen nor touched. He left all his belongings and money to Tatiana. After Alexander left and Tatiana fell into hibernation, only 3 letters came from him expressing the longing and suffering he felt and the advances of the German offensive in the Soviet territories. After several months without any letters, a worried Tatiana left Lazarevo and set out to search for Alexander. She returned to her dilapidated house in Leningrad in the empty city, where she realized that Alexander visited that house from time to time and waited until he met her. After a weekend together, Alexandria returned to the ward and Tatiana starts working as a nurse in the hospital for the war wounded. After some time, Alexandria arrives at the emergency room of the hospital injured and burned. In a hospital where there was a lack of medicine and even less blood, Tatiana, sitting next to him, was transfusing blood directly with a catheter from her veins to his veins. She fed him with her own blood while carrying their child. Amazed by this news, but convinced that the Soviet Union was not a safe place for his Tatiana, Alexander once again thinks about his origins and the American dream. Hatching a plan to escape to America. Convinced that he himself would be arrested by the NKVD and that Tatiana would never leave BS without him, Alexandri decides to leave the hospital, leaving behind the death certificate as evidence for Tatiana, whom he wanted to send safely to his homeland for a free life without persecution together with their child. Sick and completely devastated, with the death certificate in hand, Tatiana decides to leave, disguised as part of the medical staff of the Red Cross, in an ambulance to Finland and then to America. Passing through an ordeal of suffering, Tatiana, sick with tuberculosis and pregnant, managed to arrive at the Helsinki University Hospital between the borders and bullet barricades. After a few days of recovery, on a train to Stockholm, Tatiana would manage to enter the hold of a Swedish ship headed for New York. In the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, at the end of June, inside a ship, Tatiana, who had just turned 19, sick and all alone, dressed in the uniform of the Red Cross, gave birth to her and Alexander's baby, whom she named of his father Anthony Alexander Barrington. "You will not be able to live. You, Queen? You will find a way to live without me. You will find a way to live for both of us." had told Alexander then to Tatiana, in Lazarevo when they were young and in love.